The day we moved into the new neighborhood, there was a sense of hope lingering in the air, like a fresh breeze cutting through years of stale struggle. I had finally retired from the Navy SEALs after 2 decades of service, missions in places I can't even mention, scars I don't like to show, and memories I try my best not to carry into my new life. My daughter, Ellie, was the reason I came back in one piece. Born prematurely and diagnosed early with cerebral palsy, she never had it easy, not from the start. But there's a strength in her that would put most warriors I've met to shame. She doesn't walk the way other kids do. She needs a mobility chair and leg braces, but she talks like a queen and thinks like a genius. She's only 7, but has the insight of someone who's seen the world and felt every part of it. We came to Willow Heights to get away from chaos, to finally live a quiet life, maybe grow some flowers, ride our bikes, go for burgers on the weekend. I chose this neighborhood because it was quiet, it had a good school with an inclusive program, and it looked peaceful, at least from the outside. The house was perfect, with a little porch Ellie could sit on in the evening, birds chirping in the trees nearby, and sidewalks smooth enough for her wheelchair. I thought we had found a haven. That was before I met her, the HOA president everyone called Miss Karen. I should have known something was wrong the first time we met. She didn't smile when she saw Ellie. Her eyes narrowed, her lips curled, as if Ellie being disabled was a personal offense to her perfectly trimmed lawn and flower beds. "Oh," she said in that sharp, clipped voice, "I didn't realize you had that kind of child." I felt a heat rise in my chest, but I kept it contained. Years of military discipline don't just disappear. I smiled and said, "That kind of child is my daughter. Her name's Ellie. Say hi, sweetheart." Ellie waved and said with her usual sunshine, "Hi, I like your necklace." Karen didn't reply. She just nodded, tight-lipped, and walked away like we were the mess on her shoe. I brushed it off. Maybe she had a bad day. Maybe she didn't know how to interact. But it didn't stop. Over the next few weeks, there were letters in our mailbox about the wheelchair ramp on our porch being unsightly and not in keeping with the uniformity of the neighborhood. Notes about unauthorized decorations because Ellie had drawn colorful butterflies in chalk on the sidewalk. Warnings about the danger of sidewalk clutter when Ellie's adaptive trike was parked outside for 5 minutes. I tried to stay polite, tried to meet her halfway. I offered to repaint the ramp to match the house. I washed off the chalk myself. I parked the trike in the garage, but it wasn't about the rules. It was about us. More specifically about Ellie, and Karen made that clear whenever she happened to see us in the neighborhood. She would stare at Ellie, muttering under her breath about how certain people didn't belong. Once, she even asked if Ellie would be attending the block party, and when I said yes, she said, "Well, maybe we should consider allergy-safe treats this year, like gluten-free, nut-free, fun-free, child-free." I kept calm. I always do, but something inside me was simmering. You don't spend years hunting war criminals, rescuing hostages, and sneaking into terrorist compounds without knowing how to wait. And I was waiting, praying it wouldn't escalate. But evil never just stays silent. It waits too, and one day it acts. Ellie didn't know any of this. I kept her in the bubble of her world, books, cartoons, and bedtime stories. She loved KFC. I used to bring it home when I was still in the Navy, and she always called it the crunchy chicken. So, that Friday after her therapy session and a good week at school, I told her we were eating out, just me and her daddy-daughter time. Her eyes lit up and she wore her favorite shirt, the one with a big cartoon lion that said, "Roar means I love you." We rolled into the KFC at 6:30 p.m., found a corner table near the window, and ordered her favorite, drumsticks, mashed potatoes, and a chocolate chip cookie. I remember looking at her as she laughed while dipping chicken into gravy and telling me about her new friend at school, a boy who stuttered but liked space just as much as she did. I remember the sunlight bouncing off her hair, the innocence in her smile, the quiet joy that wrapped itself around our table like a warm hug. That moment was perfect. That moment was peace. And that moment was shattered when I heard that voice behind me, sharp as broken glass. "Oh, look who it is," Karen sneered, standing at the counter with her arms crossed and a cruel smirk on her lips. Didn't realize this was a charity kitchen. I turned slowly, locking eyes with her. Ellie froze. She knew that voice. Karen stepped closer. Taking up 2 tables again, I see, she spat, her eyes dropping to Ellie's chair. Maybe if she got out of that thing once in a while, she wouldn't need to eat so much fried food. The entire restaurant went quiet. You could hear the hum of the soda machine and the distant beep of the fryer. I stood up calmly, placing myself between Karen and my daughter. Leave, I said quietly. This isn't the time. But Karen didn't leave. She stepped forward, looked over my shoulder, and said to Ellie, "You're a burden, you know that? A burden on your daddy, on this community, and on people who actually work hard." Ellie's lip trembled. I could see her confusion morphing into fear. And that's when Karen did it. She lunged forward and kicked Ellie's chair hard, right at the wheel, causing it to jerk sideways and nearly topple. Ellie screamed, falling against the sidearm, tears spilling instantly. I moved faster than thought, catching her, steadying the chair, pulling her into my arms. "What the hell is wrong with you?" I roared, the entire restaurant now watching in stunned silence. Karen smirked, pulled out her phone, and said, "You saw him, right? He just threatened me. Assault. Call the cops." She turned to the cashier and yelled, "Call the police. This man just attacked me." I looked at Ellie, shaking, crying, clutching my shirt. I looked at Karen, laughing now, thinking she won. And I made a silent vow in that moment, one I would carry with me like a mission brief. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. She thought she humiliated me. She thought she could harm my daughter and walk away. What she didn't know was who I really was, what I was capable of, what I had done for my country. She had no idea the storm she had just unleashed. The world slowed to a crawl as Ellie clung to me, her sobs small and panicked, shaking in my arms as if her entire reality had shattered like glass underfoot. And for the first time in years, I felt the full weight of helpless rage threaten to break through the calm I had mastered in war zones far more dangerous than a fried chicken joint in suburban America. But this wasn't some tactical battlefield. This was my daughter, my family, my peace, assaulted not by a trained enemy, but by a bitter, smug woman hiding behind her HOA badge and her venomous entitlement. And in that moment, as Karen continued shouting about police and fake assaults, all while grinning like she had just won a prize, I scanned the room, noted the blank stares, the few camera phones raised cautiously, the manager frozen in indecision, and I knew exactly what was happening. Karen wasn't just attacking out of impulse. This was manipulation in real time. She was controlling the narrative, spinning the scene, weaponizing public doubt and the assumption that disabled children are just unfortunate background noise, and single fathers with military builds must be dangerous men with tempers ready to snap. So I stood upright, gently handed Ellie her stuffed unicorn from the pouch of her chair, and turned to the approaching police officers, two of them, young, unsure, eyes bouncing between Karen's smug posture and my calm but clearly seething expression. And before they could even ask, Karen launched into her story like a practiced liar who's had years of getting her way. Officer, I was just ordering food when this man began threatening me, yelling, being aggressive in front of children, and then he shoved me when I tried to calm his daughter. She was causing a scene, screaming. People were disturbed. And the absurdity of her words made my jaw tense so tight, I thought I might snap a molar, but I kept my voice steady because if there's one thing they teach you in Black Ops, it's how to control your breathing, your pulse, your presence. So I looked the officers in the eye and said, I have security clearance higher than either of you can access without a warrant. I've served this country across 5 continents, and I've buried brothers in places the news will never name. What you're going to do is look at the security footage, interview the staff, and stop listening to this woman's performance. But of course, Karen gasped dramatically and said, Oh, now he's threatening you too, did you hear that? He's dangerous, and one of the officers gently pulled me aside while the other awkwardly asked Karen to calm down and step outside, and I felt the humiliation rising, not because of the situation itself, but because Ellie was watching, because my daughter, my brave, joyful, innocent girl, had just been kicked, hurt, degraded, and now watched as the woman who did it got treated like some flustered neighborhood mom instead of the predator she was. And when the officer asked me to tell my side, I didn't hold back. I told him about the months of HOA harassment, the letters, the sidewalk accusations, the subtle digs, and now this, an assault in a public restaurant, and I watched his face shift slowly from neutral to unsure, because now the pieces were forming, and thankfully the manager finally stepped up and said the whole thing was on the restaurant's cameras, that he'd seen the kick himself, and the other customers began whispering, one or two nodding in agreement with me, and while the officers were reviewing the footage in the back, Karen tried again, marching up to Ellie's chair, feigning concern, saying loudly, Sweetie, are you okay? I didn't mean to scare you, I was just trying to help you stand up properly, and before I could intercept, Ellie flinched back so hard she nearly fell from her seat, and I stepped between them like a wall, eye to eye with Karen, who suddenly wasn't smiling anymore, just seething under her breath as she hissed, You're going to regret moving here, you, and that broken thing you call a daughter. And in that instant, every cell in my body screamed to act, but instead I said the 5 words she least expected, You just made a mistake. And I knew then that she didn't just kick a child, she kicked a hornet's nest wearing civilian clothes, and when the officers returned, the senior one with a tight expression told her she'd need to come to the station for formal report, and that witnesses confirmed she had made contact with the minor. But even then, Karen smiled and said, Oh, my lawyer will eat this up. I know the chief. This is a waste of time. And she wasn't lying. She was released 2 hours later with no charges filed yet, just a pending report. And suddenly I was back home holding my daughter in the quiet living room, her eyes still red, asking softly, Daddy, why did she hate me? And no amount of Navy training, no tactical gear, no adrenaline or strength could prepare me for that question, because it broke me deeper than any combat wound I've ever taken, and I held her close and whispered. Because some people are broken inside, sweetheart, and they try to break others, but I won't let that happen to you. And from that night, I stopped being just a father. I became a ghost with a mission, an operator without orders, but with purpose. And while Ellie rested, I stayed up combing through emails, revisiting every HOA message, every photo of her violations, every snide note Karen left. And I began building a case, not the kind the courts expect, but the kind that leaves no room for escape, a timeline of her cruelty, a map of her hate. And as I researched, I started seeing patterns, neighbors too scared to speak, past HOA members who resigned without explanation, stories of other disabled residents quietly moving away. And I knew then this wasn't a one time attack. This was a woman who had bullied people under the radar for years, using her position, her image, and her web of influence to stay untouchable. But not anymore, not with me, because I've dismantled terror cells that operated in silence. And I wasn't about to let a suburban tyrant get away with harming my daughter. And so I began reaching out, first to a friend in cybersecurity, then to an old contact in investigative journalism, and then to a buddy who owed me a favor from the time we snuck out 30 schoolgirls from an extremist compound overseas, each one of them ready to help, no questions asked. And I realized then that Karen thought this was over, that she could kick a disabled child and gaslight the world and walk away smugly like nothing happened. But what she didn't know was that every move she made now was being watched, documented, prepared to be turned against her with absolute precision. And while I still kissed Ellie goodnight and read her bedtime stories, every spare second I had was dedicated to war, not with guns or blades, but with data, with records, with evidence and strategy. And when Ellie asked the next weekend if we could go to a different restaurant because the red one makes me scared now, I swallowed my fury and told her of course we could. And when she smiled again, even for a second, I knew I couldn't fail. Not this mission, not this time, because the enemy had come too close to home, and home is the one battlefield I'll never surrender. The moment I shifted from passive father to silent operator, the world around Karen began to shift in ways she didn't notice, or maybe she noticed but was too arrogant to imagine it was anything other than coincidence. But I wasn't relying on luck, not this time, because what she had done was more than personal. It was tactical warfare against my child, and that demanded response not with rage, but with precision. So I activated the same instincts I once used to dismantle paramilitary networks. Only this time, the target was suburban, the mask wore pearls instead of fatigues, and the war was psychological, legal, and deeply personal. My first call went to Ryan, my old tech lead from SEAL Team 6, who now worked in digital security. He owed me for a mission in Hellman that went sideways until I pulled him out, and when he picked up the phone and I said, I need her digital footprint, he didn't hesitate for a second, and within 48 hours, I had access to more than Karen would ever expect: public records, old business filings, HOA meeting transcripts, social media profiles, Reddit usernames she forgot were linked, and even Nextdoor posts under burner names she used to spread neighborhood rumors anonymously, and the picture that emerged was darker than I anticipated. This woman didn't just hate Ellie, she had made a sport of targeting people she deemed unfit for her neighborhood. A black couple who had a service dog and moved out quietly, a veteran with PTSD who violated noise policy every time he had a nightmare, even a single mother with a son in a wheelchair who left after Karen publicly accused her of faking the disability for sympathy. The pattern was consistent and chilling. Karen wasn't just cruel, she was methodical, systemic, and weaponized her HOA power with surgical cruelty masked as policy enforcement. And as I built a dossier, I realized this was bigger than just one woman's hate. It was a network of silence, of neighbors too afraid to speak, of minor injustices stacking up into life-ruining moments. And I wasn't going to let it stand, so I reached out to Julie, a friend from my days in DC who had transitioned from intelligence analyst to local investigative journalist for a mid-tier online publication with a national reach when the stories were hot enough. And I told her everything. Not just about Ellie, not just about the kick, but the entire timeline, the footage, the HOA intimidation, the toxic history, and by the end of the call, she was quiet, then said, This isn't a story, it's an expose waiting to explode. And from there, I began mapping Karen's weaknesses, just like I would an insurgent leader: financial pressure points, social allies, legal vulnerabilities, and I found gold. Her HOA tenure had been extended illegally by vote manipulation. She had pocketed fees for beautification contracts, paid to fake companies registered in her brother's name. She had forged resident signatures on several notices. And most damning of all, she had once been involved in a sealed court case after a physical altercation with a teenage girl who had developmental delays, a case buried in the county clerk's archives under mutual conflict until I leaned on a former JAG officer I knew and got the unofficial details. It wasn't mutual at all. Karen had pushed the girl during a library event for speaking too loudly, and her lawyer had threatened the family with a defamation suit until they backed down. This wasn't a mistake, it was a pattern, and once the foundation was laid, I contacted Marcus, one of the best litigation strategists I knew, someone I once pulled out of enemy hands after he was captured during an embassy evacuation mission. He now worked as a high-profile disability rights attorney, and when I told him what happened to Ellie, he flew out the same week, no retainer, no hesitation, because brothers in arms don't ask for payment when it comes to protecting family. Together, we built a legal packet that would make Karen sweat before it ever hit a courtroom. And while Julie worked behind the scenes interviewing former neighbors who were finally emboldened to talk, Marcus helped prepare for a civil and criminal filing that would include assault on a disabled minor, HOA fraud, targeted harassment, and possibly even a RICO case if the financial web panned out further. But we weren't done yet. I had one more move to make, one that would break Karen in the court of public opinion, because it wasn't enough to beat her legally. She had to be seen, exposed, her mask peeled back for the world to witness. So I arranged a community event under a neutral banner, Neighborhood Safety and Awareness Forum, a harmless-sounding HOA-sponsored Q&A that Karen herself approved before realizing who the guest speakers were. Me, a decorated veteran and local resident; Marcus, an expert on HOA abuse of power; and Julie, who was releasing her article the next day to coincide with the fallout, and as the day approached, I kept my distance from Karen, watching as she strutted through the neighborhood, still smug, still smiling, still completely unaware that the floor beneath her was about to collapse. But the signs were starting to show. Two neighbors stopped waving at her, a few lawn signs had disappeared, and the quiet murmurs of discontent were beginning to ripple just under the surface. And on the night of the event, Ellie stayed with a friend from school, while I walked into that brightly lit community hall not as a soldier, not as a father seeking pity, but as a strategist executing the final phase of the mission, and the room filled quickly, more than we expected. Neighbors, local reporters tipped off by Julie, and even the mayor's assistant who had heard whispers about HOA corruption bubbling to the surface. And when I took the microphone, I told the story not as a victim, but as a witness to systemic abuse, as a father who saw his disabled daughter kicked in front of strangers and watched the perpetrator weaponize status and influence to twist the truth. And then I laid out the timeline, the proof, the names, the connections, and Marcus followed with the legal implications, the violations, the rights that were trampled, while Julie gave voice to the others, the families who had been silenced, displaced, hurt. And by the time we were done, the room was stunned, silent, buzzing, with a different kind of electricity, and then Karen walked. In late, unaware, dressed in her usual smug composure until she saw me at the podium, saw the projector screen with her emails, her memos, her own words laid bare, and I watched the blood drain from her face as the crowd turned toward her, not with admiration, but with contempt, confusion, betrayal. And still, she tried to speak, to deflect, to accuse, but it was too late. The evidence was already submitted to the board, the lawsuit already filed, the article already scheduled to go live at midnight with national syndication. And as she stood frozen in the doorway, I stepped down from the podium, walked past her without flinching, and whispered just loud enough for her to hear, "This isn't revenge, it's accountability." And in that moment, I saw something I hadn't seen in her before. Fear. Not fear of violence, but fear of losing control, of being known, of being stripped of her power. And as I walked out into the cool night air, I looked up at the stars and knew the mission wasn't over yet. But the first phase was complete, and Karen's empire of silence had just been shattered. The courthouse was cold, not just in temperature, but in spirit, the kind of place where people's truths were laid bare whether they were ready or not. And as I sat on the hard wooden bench with Ellie beside me, her hand curled around mine, I couldn't help but reflect on how far we'd come since that night at KFC, since the moment my innocent daughter had been kicked by a woman so consumed with control and cruelty that she mistook silence for weakness. And today would be different because today's silence had a voice, and that voice was ready to thunder across the courtroom. Because justice wasn't just about legal documents or procedural hearings, it was about the truth being undeniable, about showing the world what happens when you try to crush someone who refuses to stay broken. And as the clerk called the case, State of California versus Karen Elizabeth Hargrove, I saw Karen enter, flanked by a pale-faced defense attorney who looked like he hadn't slept in days, and Karen, once proud and polished, now walked like she was trudging through wet concrete, her confidence cracked, her movements jittery, her signature pearls gone, replaced by trembling fingers and darting eyes that scanned the courtroom for friendly faces and found none, because the room was packed. Former neighbors who had once feared her, reporters from multiple states who picked up Julie's expose, disability rights advocates, and Ellie's school staff, all seated quietly, all watching, all ready. And when the judge entered and the trial began, it wasn't a spectacle. It was a methodical, devastating unraveling of everything Karen had built on lies, her attorney stuttering through objections that were overruled, evidence presented by Marcus that included security footage of the KFC assault, HOA documents showing misappropriated funds and forged signatures, sworn testimonies from neighbors she had silenced, and digital correspondence that showed, without a doubt, her obsession with targeting families like mine. And when I was called to the stand, I spoke not with rage, but with clarity. I described the slow progression of harassment, the escalation of violence, and the trauma it caused my daughter. And I made sure they saw her sitting in the courtroom, clutching her stuffed unicorn, listening quietly, not with pity, but with courage. And when Marcus asked me what I felt that day Karen kicked her, I said, I felt like I had failed to protect her, not because I wasn't strong enough, but because I didn't expect evil to come in the form of a neighbor wearing perfume. And in that moment, even the judge paused, pen still, as if he too understood the gravity of what had been done. And when Karen took the stand, she tried to spin the same story, misunderstanding, confusion, concern for the child's well-being, but Marcus dismantled her with calm efficiency, showing inconsistencies in her timeline, contradictions in her statements, and highlighting her prior sealed record, which the judge had agreed to consider under special motion. And when asked directly if she had kicked Ellie's wheelchair, Karen replied, I might have nudged it by accident. And that was the moment everything shifted, because Marcus played the footage again, frame by frame, and the courtroom watched her body lunge forward in slow motion, watched her foot connect with the wheel in a way that no one could call accidental, watched Ellie's chair twist, watched her cry out, and the silence afterward was louder than any gavel strike. And as the defense squirmed and the media scribbled notes, I knew the story had already broken beyond the courtroom. And when the judge recessed for sentencing, the room buzzed not with drama, but with gravity, and when we reconvened, he delivered the verdict with firm, measured words. Guilty on all charges, including assault of a disabled minor, criminal misconduct as an HOA official, and fraud. And then he did something unexpected. He asked if I wanted to deliver a victim impact statement before sentencing, and I stood, walked to the front of the room, and spoke, not as a Navy SEAL, not as a litigant, but as a father, and I said, when I was deployed, I saw villages destroyed, lives ruined, children terrified, but I always thought the war would stay behind me. What I never imagined was coming home and watching my daughter face violence in a restaurant from someone who smiled in public and spewed hate behind closed doors. Karen didn't just hurt my child's body, she tried to break her spirit, and that kind of violence leaves no bruises, but it festers, and today we stop it from spreading further. And then I turned, looked directly at Karen, and said, You thought no one would believe a little girl in a wheelchair. You were wrong. The world believed her before it ever believed you. And when I returned to my seat, Ellie squeezed my hand and whispered, I'm proud of you, Daddy, and my throat closed so tightly I couldn't speak, and the judge, clearly moved, sentenced Karen to 5 years in state prison. community restitution to disability programs, and barred her from ever serving on an HOA board or having authority over residential matters again. And as she was led out in cuffs, reporters swarmed outside, cameras, flashing microphones raised, and Julie stood by the steps holding her published article like a torch, the headline bold. HOA President's Reign of Terror Ends After Disabled Child's Assault Unleashes Nationwide Reckoning, and the story went viral within hours, sparking new investigations into HOA corruption across the country, and people began to speak out, empowered by Ellie's strength by our story, and as for us, we went home, not just to a house, but to a place finally free from shadows. And I helped Ellie into her bed that night, her favorite blanket over her legs. And as I turned off the light, she looked up at me and asked, "Do you think she's sorry?" And I paused, then replied, "Maybe not yet, but that's not our burden anymore." And she nodded, turning over to sleep. And for the first time in months, she didn't flinch at every sound, didn't ask to lock the door twice, didn't keep the hallway light on. And as I stepped outside into the cool night air, I realized the mission was complete. Not because I won a legal case or brought someone down, but because I gave my daughter back her peace, and that, more than any medal or rank I ever earned, would always be the greatest victory of my life. The tension in the classroom had reached a near unbearable peak, the air thick with the residual echoes of Karen Whitmore's failed attacks, and yet she remained a looming threat, pacing with calculated menace. Eyes locked on Emily Carter as if measuring the child's vulnerability, while Daniel Carter stayed unwavering at her side, every muscle taut, every movement precise, a living shield between his daughter and the chaos Karen sought to unleash, and Emily, small but emboldened by her father's steadfast presence, gripped the armrests of her wheelchair, her body trembling but her spirit quietly igniting with newfound courage as she realized that fear had no dominion over her when she was protected by love and moral authority, and the students, sensing the shift, began to breathe more evenly, some whispering words of support to Emily, while others watched wide-eyed as the ultimate showdown of cruelty and resilience unfolded before them, a scene suspended in time, heavy with suspense. And Karen, sensing her control slipping further, clenched her fists, her mind racing through desperate strategies, half-formed threats, and subtle psychological maneuvers, each more reckless than the last, her arrogance giving way to frustration as she realized that the power she had wielded for so long had been met with an unyielding force she could not intimidate, manipulate, or break, and in that critical moment, Daniel's calm but commanding voice cut through the thick tension, grounding the room, demanding Karen step back and leave, not with threats, but with an unshakable authority that carried the weight of truth, love, and unrelenting protection, and Emily, inspired by this display, lifted her chin slightly, eyes bright with defiance, realizing she could survive, endure, and even rise above the cruelty she had faced, a spark of hope and courage now illuminating her small frame. And Karen, desperate to reclaim dominance, made one final lunge, her hand aimed at Emily's wheelchair. But Daniel's reflexes, guided by instinct and fueled by paternal love, intercepted her instantly, securing both Emily and the chair, the sheer force of his presence leaving no room for error. While the students collectively gasped, hearts racing, their minds caught between awe and fear, and in that suspended instant, Emily felt a surge of strength she had never known, a recognition that she was no longer powerless, that the small, vulnerable child Karen had sought to terrify was now shielded, protected, and even emboldened by her father's unwavering courage, and the classroom, once a battlefield of fear and chaos, now became a theater of moral victory, the suspense transforming into relief and quiet triumph, though the weight of past cruelty still lingered in the air. Karen, realizing her final attempt had failed, froze mid-motion, eyes wide with disbelief, her mind racing for excuses, manipulation, or some last-minute escape. But Daniel, steady and unwavering, kept his protective stance, his gaze locked onto hers, a silent but powerful message that any further aggression would be met with immediate consequence, and Emily, heart still pounding, felt the full emotional impact of the moment, understanding for the first time the depth of her own resilience, the protective power of love, and the strength that comes from being seen, valued, and defended. And as the teacher moved in to support both Emily and Daniel, subtly guiding Karen toward the door, the students whispered, among themselves, sharing glances of awe, fear, and relief as the reality of what had transpired began to settle in, the suspense giving way to a tentative sense of safety, a fragile but undeniable shift in power. Karen, defeated for the moment, cast one last, venomous glance at Emily, a mixture of anger, frustration, and disbelief flashing across her face, before finally retreating fully from a room, the echo of her polished shoes fading into the distance, leaving Emily and Daniel standing. Together, the protective bond between them radiating in the quiet aftermath, while the students slowly exhaled, the emotional intensity finally releasing, the suspense giving way to the realization that evil had been confronted and met with unwavering courage. And Emily, though still trembling, allowed a small, victorious smile, a recognition that despite fear, pain, and humiliation she had survived, endured, and even grown stronger, her father's presence having transformed the classroom from a site of terror into a space of resilience, justice, and hope, leaving the audience emotionally captivated, hearts racing, and fully engaged, knowing that while Karen's obsession and cruelty were still a lurking threat, this chapter had concluded with a decisive, emotionally satisfying victory for courage, protection, and love. The classroom was finally quiet, the storm of chaos, fear, and suspense having passed, leaving Emily Carter sitting in her wheelchair, trembling but upright, her hands still clutching the armrests, while Daniel Carter remained steadfastly by her side, a living shield whose presence radiated safety, authority, and love. And as the other students slowly recovered from the emotional whirlwind they had witnessed, whispers of awe and empathy filled the room, a mix of relief and lingering tension, because though Karen Whitmore had retreated, her obsession, cruelty, and vindictive nature were far from gone, a shadow lurking just beyond the walls, waiting for an opportunity to resurface, and Emily, absorbing the calm, felt a mixture of exhaustion, relief, and the first true sense of empowerment she had experienced in years, a realization that though fear had been her constant companion, she now had courage, protection, and a father who would stop at nothing to defend her, and in that moment, Daniel gently guided her hands from the armrests, offering a reassuring squeeze and a soft, calm reminder that she was safe, loved, and stronger than she knew, while the students, inspired by the resilience and bravery they had witnessed, began to murmur quietly among themselves, sharing tentative smiles, supportive glances, and a newfound respect for Emily, for Daniel, and for the unshakable bond that had triumphed over fear and cruelty. And even as the classroom settled into relative calm, a subtle tension lingered in the air, the audience acutely aware that Karen's dark obsession was not fully extinguished, that her mind, cunning and calculating, would continue to look for cracks, opportunities, and ways to assert control over those she deemed weaker. Yet the emotional weight of the day's events had shifted power irreversibly, the lessons of courage, love, and resilience carving deep impressions in every witness's mind, and Emily, feeling her heart slow and her breathing steady, allowed herself a small smile, tears mingling with relief, a recognition that though the ordeal had been terrifying, she had survived, endured, and emerged stronger, while Daniel's eyes softened, scanning the classroom, meeting the teacher's nod of acknowledgement, and recognizing the resilience of the students who had observed, endured, and silently supported Emily throughout the chaos. A testament to human empathy and courage in the face of intimidation, and in the corner of the room, the faint memory of Karen's presence hung like a shadow, a lingering threat that added suspense, reminding the audience that though victory had been achieved today, vigilance would always be necessary, that evil may retreat, but rarely disappears, and that the true measure of strength lies in the ability to stand firm, protect the vulnerable, and face fear without flinching. And as Emily and Daniel quietly began to collect her scattered belongings, the classroom exhaled collectively, the weight of terror lifting while the impact of courage and protection remained indelibly imprinted, and the audience, fully immersed, could feel the adrenaline, suspense, and emotional intensity give way to a satisfying resolution, knowing that though Karen's shadow still loomed impossibility, the day's events had established an unbreakable bond of love, resilience, and moral authority, leaving hearts racing, minds engaged, and a lingering, thrilling awareness that courage and protection could triumph, even over calculated cruelty, a suspenseful, emotionally powerful conclusion that tied together the story's tension, fear, and hope, delivering full impact while leaving just enough uncertainty to remind everyone that vigilance and courage are eternal, and that Emily's journey, though victorious in this chapter, was part of a larger story of resilience, strength, and the enduring power of love in the face of darkness.